Doctor. Sarah Mitchell's hand froze on the cemetery gate, her breath catching as 200 mourners suddenly scattered like startled birds across the African grassland. It wasn't the wailing that stopped her heart. It was the silence that followed. A massive male lion emerged from the acacia trees, his golden mane catching the harsh Kenyan sun as he walked deliberately through the panicked crowd toward the simple wooden casket. Jesus Christ! Marcus Thornfield's weathered hand flew to his tranquilizer gun, his 20 years of hunting experience screaming danger. Children cried as their mothers swept them behind Land Rovers, but the lion never broke stride. Sarah's throat constricted as she recognized those amber eyes, the same eyes that had watched her father, Frank Hartwell, feed him milk from a bottle 12 years ago when he was just an orphaned cub. "Nobody move," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of her own thundering heartbeat. What happened next would shatter everything these people thought they knew about love, loyalty, and the bonds that transcend death itself. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching. From now, let's continue with the story. Frank Hartwell had never planned to end up in the middle of nowhere, Kenya at 73 years old, but life has a way of taking you places you never expected. The retired Nebraska corn farmer had sold his family's 640-acre spread 5 years after his wife Margaret passed, unable to bear another sunset over fields that reminded him of her laughter echoing across the prairie. With nothing left to lose and everything to atone for, he'd taken his life savings and bought a one-way ticket to Nairobi, determined to spend his remaining years doing something that mattered. The Masai Mara had welcomed him like a long-lost son. For 15 years, he'd worked as a volunteer ranger at the remote Acacia Point station, learning Swahili from local guides and developing an almost supernatural ability to communicate with the wildlife. The other rangers called him Mzee Simba, Old Lion, not just for his white hair and weathered face, but for the way big cats seemed to trust him implicitly. Frank had a gift, they said, though he'd always insisted it was nothing more than patience and respect. Dr. Sarah Mitchell arrived at Masai Mara 3 years ago with impeccable credentials from Stanford University and a 2-year research grant to study lion social behavior. At 35, she was everything Frank had never been: educated, sophisticated, and utterly dedicated to her work. She'd grown up in Ohio with loving adoptive parents who'd given her every opportunity, yet something indefinable always felt missing, like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit. Her colleagues back home thought her obsession with African wildlife was just academic passion, but Sarah knew it was something deeper, a pull she couldn't explain. Marcus Thornfield commanded respect through fear rather than affection. The 58-year-old former British Army officer had spent the last 20 years in various African countries, ostensibly working wildlife security but actually pursuing a very personal vendetta. His official title was Head of Wildlife Protection Services, but everyone knew his real mission was eliminating problem animals that posed threats to human settlements. The death of his 8-year-old son David in a lion attack 2 decades earlier had transformed a loving father into something harder, colder, a man who saw every big cat as a potential killer that needed to be stopped before it struck again. And then there was Django, whose story began 12 years ago when Frank found him as a 4-month-old cub, barely alive beside his mother's poached carcass. The tiny lion had been riddled with infected wounds and so malnourished his ribs showed through matted fur. Any reasonable person would have called the veterinary service or, more likely, put the suffering animal out of its misery. But Frank Hartwell had lost too much in his life to let death win another round without a fight. He'd carried that dying cub back to his station, fed him with a baby bottle every 2 hours, and slept on the floor beside the makeshift pen for 6 months until Django was strong enough to survive on his own. What happened next defied every textbook on wildlife behavior Sarah had ever read. The first warning came on a Tuesday morning in March when the acacia trees were heavy with yellow blossoms and the air smelled of rain that wouldn't come for another month. Frank had been making his usual rounds, checking the solar panels that powered the remote water pumps, when the crushing pain hit his chest like a sledgehammer. He'd felt his heart skip before. Hell, at 73, who hadn't? But this was different. This was his body's way of telling him his time was running short. Sarah found him 20 minutes later, collapsed beside the main water hole where elephants came to drink at dawn. His face was gray as old concrete, sweat beading on his forehead despite the morning chill. She'd seen enough medical emergencies during her fieldwork to know a heart attack when she saw one, and the 4-hour drive to Nairobi General Hospital felt like the longest journey of her life. Frank drifted in and out of consciousness, mumbling about Django and someone named Margaret, while Sarah pushed her Land Rover harder than she'd ever dared. "Your heart muscle is severely damaged," Dr. Kamau explained later, pointing to the EKG printout with the detached professionalism that doctors use when delivering death sentences. "The next episode will likely be fatal. You need to consider moving closer to medical facilities, Mr. Hartwell. What you're doing out there, it's not sustainable for a man in your condition." Frank had listened politely, nodded at the appropriate moments, and asked for his discharge papers before the ink was dry on his prescription. "These animals need me more than I need a few extra years," he told Sarah as they drove back toward Masai Mara. "A man's got to die of something. Might as well be doing what matters." It was during that hospital stay that Sarah's world began to unravel in ways she never saw coming. While Frank was sedated for tests, she'd volunteered to handle his paperwork, figuring someone should make sure his insurance information was current. That's when she saw the name on his emergency contact form, written in careful block letters. Sarah Mitchell, biological daughter, Stanford University. The folder fell from her hands, medical forms scattering across the hospital floor like fallen leaves. Sarah stared at those words until they blurred, her mind racing through 35 years of carefully constructed identity. Her adoptive parents had always been honest about the adoption, but they'd never known details about her birth family. "Your mother died young," they'd said. "Your father couldn't care for you alone." Standard story, she'd always assumed. Nothing that required further investigation. But here was Frank Hartwell, this gruff old man who'd become her mentor and friend over the past 3 years, claiming to be the father who'd given her away before she was old enough to remember his face. The revelation should have felt like finding a missing piece of herself, but instead it felt like discovering the puzzle she'd been working on her entire life was actually a completely different picture. While Sarah grappled with personal revelations, Marcus Thornfield was dealing with professional ones. The manila envelope arrived at his office via secure courier bearing the official seal of the International Wildlife Protection Council and marked "Priority, Immediate Action Required." Inside was a single page that would change everything. Authorization for the immediate elimination of one adult male lion, designated as human-habituated and potentially dangerous to public safety. The target description matched Django perfectly. Age, territory, distinctive scar pattern, and most damning of all, extensive history of human contact leading to abnormal behavioral patterns. Marcus had been waiting 20 years for an opportunity like this, a chance to eliminate a lion with full legal backing and institutional support. The irony wasn't lost on him that Frank Hartwell's precious rescue project had finally been classified as exactly what Marcus had always claimed it was, a dangerous animal that posed an unacceptable risk to human life. The authorization came with a 30-day deadline and strict instructions about documentation requirements. Every aspect of the elimination had to be recorded and justified for the International Review Board. Marcus smiled grimly as he locked the papers in his desk safe. After 2 decades of hunting problem animals across 3 countries, he knew exactly how to make this look like a routine public safety operation. What Marcus didn't know was that Sarah had spent the previous month documenting something that could change everything. Her research into Django's behavior had revealed cognitive abilities that bordered on the miraculous. Not supernatural, but certainly unprecedented in wild lion populations. Django could distinguish between 47 different vehicle sounds, recognize 23 distinct human voices, and had been observed demonstrating what could only be described as empathy toward other species in distress. The data was compelling enough that Sarah had already begun drafting a paper for the Journal of Animal Behavior, with plans to submit her findings within the week. If her research proved what she suspected, that Django represented a significant evolutionary development in large predator intelligence, it could revolutionize wildlife protection protocols worldwide. But first, she had to confront Frank about the hospital paperwork and demand answers about 35 years of carefully hidden truth. Sarah confronted Frank 3 days after they returned from Nairobi, when the morning mist still clung to the acacia trees and the world felt suspended between night and day. She'd spent 72 hours wrestling with the hospital paperwork, checking and rechecking those impossible words. Biological daughter. The private investigator she'd hired in Ohio had worked with ruthless efficiency, and the document spread across Frank's kitchen table told a story that made her stomach clench with equal parts grief and rage. Margaret Ann Hartwell died October 15, 1988. Complications from Huntington's disease, Sarah read aloud, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. Patient gave birth to healthy daughter 6 weeks before death. Father Frank Hartwell, age 38, relinquished parental rights November 3, 1988. She looked up at the old man who'd been pouring coffee with deliberately steady hands. "You want to explain to me why my father has been living 2,000 miles away for the last 3 years, teaching me about lion behavior while I thought my parents were dead?" Frank set down the coffee pot with the careful precision of a man buying time. His weathered face looked older than his 73 years, carved with lines that spoke of decisions that had cost him sleep for decades. "Your mother was dying, Sarah. The Huntingtons had already taken most of her memory, most of her coordination. She had maybe 6 weeks left when you were born, and those weeks were going to be nothing but pain and confusion." He sat heavily across from her, his hands wrapped around his coffee mug like it might anchor him to something solid. "I was a 38-year-old corn farmer who didn't know the first thing about raising a baby, especially not one who might have to watch her mother die inch by inch." "So you just gave me away?" The words came out sharper than Sarah intended, but 35 years of wondering about her origins had built up considerable pressure. "You couldn't handle the responsibility, so you handed me off to strangers and walked away?" "I thought I was saving you from watching her die," Frank said quietly. "I thought maybe if you grew up somewhere else, with people who could give you a real family, a real life, you'd never have to know about the disease or the pain or any of it." He looked directly at her for the first time since she'd started reading. "I was wrong about a lot of things, but I wasn't wrong about the Hartwell family in Ohio. They gave you everything I couldn't." The irony cut deep. Sarah had spent 3 years in Kenya developing a professional relationship with her biological father, never knowing that her fascination with his work might be genetic rather than purely academic. But before she could process the full implications of that revelation, Frank delivered another bombshell that changed everything she thought she understood about sacrifice and regret. "There's something else," he said, reaching into his shirt pocket and pulling out a folded letter that looked like it had been handled countless times. "This came from your mother's doctor 6 months after I signed the papers. Turns out the genetic testing they did in 1988 was flawed. Contaminated samples or some damn thing. You don't carry the Huntington's gene, Sarah. You never did. The letter fell from Sarah's numb fingers as the full weight of Frank's mistake hit her. He'd given away his healthy daughter based on medical information that was completely wrong, spending 35 years believing he'd made the ultimate sacrifice to protect her from a disease she was never going to develop. The tragedy wasn't just that they'd lost each other, it was that the loss had been completely unnecessary. While Sarah struggled to absorb the personal earthquake that was reshaping her understanding of family and identity, Marcus Thornfield was dealing with his own revelations about the past. The manila folder he'd discovered in his office files that morning contained paperwork he hadn't seen in 15 years, incident reports from his early days in Kenya, including one that made his hands shake as he read it. Vehicle accident, Nairobi-Mombasa Highway, September 12, 2008. British citizen Marcus Thornfield pulled unconscious driver from burning Land Rover approximately 2.3 kilometers east of Namanga border crossing. Driver identified as Frank Hartwell, American citizen, age 58, suffered second-degree burns and smoke inhalation, but survived due to immediate intervention. Marcus stared at the report, memories flooding back of that night 15 years ago when he'd been driving back from a failed hunting expedition. He'd been drinking, not enough to impair his driving, but enough to dull the constant ache of David's death, when he'd seen the flames by the roadside. Training had taken over, and he'd pulled an unconscious stranger from a vehicle that exploded 30 seconds later. He'd never learned the man's name, never followed up to see if he'd survived. Just another random act in a life that felt increasingly random and meaningless. But Frank Hartwell wasn't random. Frank Hartwell was the man whose lion Marcus had been authorized to kill, the man whose life's work Marcus was about to destroy. The man whose life he'd saved 15 years ago was now the obstacle standing between Marcus and his long-awaited revenge against the species that had taken his son. The cosmic irony wasn't lost on him, but it also didn't change anything. If anything, it made the situation more poetic. He'd preserved Frank's life just long enough for Frank to raise the lion that Marcus would finally have the satisfaction of eliminating. The circle would be complete, and David's death would finally mean something. Marcus locked the file away and began planning his approach. 30 days was more than enough time to ensure that Django's elimination looked routine and justified. Frank Hartwell's heart condition would likely prevent any serious interference, and Dr. Sarah Mitchell's research data would be irrelevant once the animal was dead. He had no idea that Sarah and Frank were forming an alliance that would challenge everything he thought he knew about family, loyalty, and the price of revenge. The alliance between Sarah and Frank began with desperate practicality and evolved into something deeper over the following month. They had 30 days to save Django's life, but the obstacles seemed insurmountable from every angle. The legal system favored Marcus's elimination order. The bureaucracy moved at glacial pace, and Frank's deteriorating health added urgency to everything they attempted. Their first plan, purchasing private sanctuary land where Django could live protected from government interference, collapsed when the Kenyan Wildlife Service suddenly imposed new restrictions on foreign land ownership. $2.3 million, Frank said, spreading bank statements across his kitchen table like battle plans. Every penny I got from selling the farm, plus Margaret's life insurance, plus what I've saved working here, should be enough to buy 10,000 acres and set up a proper sanctuary. His fingers traced the numbers with the reverence of a man who'd worked 60-hour weeks for 40 years to accumulate that wealth. Problem is, the legal transfer takes 6 to 8 weeks minimum, and we've got maybe 25 days before Marcus pulls that trigger. Sarah had been researching alternatives with the single-minded intensity that had earned her a PhD by age 28. Her laptop screen showed dozens of tabs, wildlife protection laws, international conservation treaties, emergency injunction procedures, and sanctuary funding options. What about a temporary restraining order? If we can prove Django poses no public threat, maybe we can buy time for the land purchase to go through? You think Marcus gives a damn about restraining orders? Frank asked, but he was already reaching for his phone. Still worth a try. Worst they can say is no. The legal maneuvering consumed precious days while Django's behavior became increasingly protective. The massive lion had always maintained a territory roughly centered on Frank's station, but now he rarely ventured more than a few kilometers away. Other rangers reported seeing him on elevated ground during daylight hours, an unusual pattern for lions who typically rested in shade during the heat of the day. It was as if Django sensed danger approaching and was maintaining visual contact with the man who'd raised him. Dr. Sarah's research data became their strongest weapon, but also their most controversial. Her documentation of Django's cognitive abilities was unprecedented. She'd recorded instances of the lion demonstrating planning behavior, emotional responses to human distress, and what could only be described as deliberate problem-solving. The video evidence was extraordinary. Django leading lost tourists back to safety, alerting rangers to injured animals, and once memorably, retrieving Frank's heart medication when the old man collapsed during a patrol. This isn't just intelligence, Sarah explained to the emergency wildlife protection hearing in Nairobi, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was claiming. This is interspecies empathy. Django doesn't just recognize humans as non-threats, he actively protects them. He's demonstrated more pro-social behavior toward humans than some humans demonstrate toward each other. But Marcus had come prepared for this argument. His counter-presentation included incident reports from across Africa, lions that had been hand-raised or extensively habituated to humans, only to eventually attack when their instincts overcame their conditioning. The statistics were sobering. Human-habituated big cats were responsible for disproportionate numbers of attacks precisely because they lacked natural fear responses that kept wild animals at safe distances. Dr. Mitchell's research is impressive, Marcus acknowledged, with the cold professionalism that made him so effective at his job. But it doesn't address the fundamental question: what happens when this lion's protective instincts are triggered by perceived threats to his territory or his human family? A 300-pound predator with no fear of humans is not a pet, regardless of how intelligent or well-meaning he might appear. The hearing officer, Dr. Elizabeth Mwangi from the University of Nairobi, found herself caught between compelling scientific evidence and established safety protocols. Dr. Mitchell, while your behavioral documentation is remarkable, Mr. Thornfield raises valid concerns about public safety. Can you guarantee that Django will never pose a threat to human life? Sarah felt the trap closing. No scientist could make absolute guarantees about animal behavior, and Marcus knew it. I can't guarantee anything with 100% certainty, she admitted, but I can document that in 12 years of freedom, Django has never shown aggression toward humans. He's had hundreds of opportunities to cause harm and has consistently chosen protection over predation. One incident, Marcus pressed, one tourist getting too close, one child wandering into his territory, one moment when his predatory instincts override his conditioning. Dr. Mitchell's research doesn't eliminate that risk. It just documents the delay before it becomes reality. The hearing concluded without resolution, buying them another 10 days while the panel deliberated. But 10 days wasn't enough for land purchase, and Frank's health was deteriorating under the stress. He'd started having minor chest pains daily, episodes that he tried to hide from Sarah but couldn't disguise entirely. His morning routines took longer, his afternoon patrols were shorter, and he'd begun sitting more frequently during tasks that used to require constant movement. "You need to see a doctor," Sarah insisted after finding him resting against a fence post that he should have been repairing. "This stress is killing you, and if you die, what happens to Django then?" "If I go to Nairobi for treatment, Marcus uses my absence to justify immediate action," Frank replied with the stubborn logic of a man who'd made peace with his mortality. "I can hold him off as long as I'm here, as long as there's a chance the legal system might protect Django. But the moment I'm out of the picture, that lion becomes just another problem animal on Marcus's list." The community divide that had been simmering beneath the surface finally erupted during a public meeting at the Masai Mara Visitor Center. Local Maasai elders who had worked alongside Frank for 15 years spoke passionately about Django's role in protecting their livestock from other predators and his unusual restraint around their children. Tourism operators were split. Some saw Django as a unique attraction that brought visitors from around the world, while others worried that any incident would destroy the area's reputation for safety. "This lion is part of our community," declared Elder Samuel Sankale, his traditional red shuka draped over safari clothes that bridged two worlds. "He has lived among us for 12 years without harming anyone. To kill him now for crimes he has not committed is not justice. It is fear masquerading as wisdom." But Marcus had supporters too, particularly among newer residents who'd moved to the area after Django was already established. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a British veterinarian who'd opened a clinic near the reserve, spoke for many when she said, "I admire what Mr. Hartwell accomplished, but we can't let sentiment override safety. One attack, just one, and we'll spend years rebuilding trust with the international community. Is preserving one lion worth risking the entire conservation program here?" The meeting dissolved into heated arguments that reflected broader tensions about wildlife management, foreign influence, and the balance between conservation and development. Sarah watched the community she'd grown to love fracturing along lines she'd never noticed before, and realized that Django's fate had become a symbol for much larger questions about how humans and wildlife could coexist in an increasingly crowded world. That night, as she sat on Frank's porch reviewing legal documents by lantern light, Sarah heard the distinctive sound of Django's approach, a low rumbling that was somehow both greeting and question. The massive lion emerged from the darkness and settled himself 20 feet away, close enough to maintain contact but far enough to respect boundaries that had been established years earlier. "He knows something's wrong," Frank said quietly, joining her on the porch with 2 cups of coffee that had become their evening ritual. "Lions are better at reading tension than most people give them credit for. He can smell the stress, hear it in our voices, feel it in the way we move around him." Sarah studied Django's posture, alert but relaxed, protective but not aggressive. In the lantern light, his golden coat seemed to glow with an inner warmth that reminded her why Frank had risked everything to save this magnificent creature. "What if we're wrong?" she asked. "What if Marcus is right, and we're letting sentiment cloud our judgment about public safety?" Frank was quiet for a long moment, watching Django watch them with those intelligent amber eyes. 35 years ago, I made a decision based on fear. Fear that you'd suffer if you stayed with me. Fear that I couldn't protect you from pain and loss. I was wrong then, and I've regretted it every day since." He set down his coffee and looked directly at his daughter for the first time since their confrontation about her adoption. "I won't make the same mistake twice. Some things are worth fighting for, even when the odds are against you." The climax arrived with Dr. Robert Chen's white Land Rover kicking up dust clouds that could be seen for miles across the Masai Mara grasslands. The court-appointed psychiatrist from Nairobi had driven 8 hours through rutted roads and police checkpoints to conduct what everyone knew would be the final evaluation of Frank Hartwell's mental competency. If Dr. Chen declared Frank unfit to make decisions about wildlife management, Marcus would have immediate authorization to eliminate Django without further legal obstacles. Sarah paced the length of Frank's small porch, her boots wearing a groove in the weathered wood as she rehearsed arguments she'd already made a dozen times. Remember, stick to facts about Django's behavior. Don't mention the dreams about Margaret. Don't talk about feeling guilty about the adoption. And for God's sake, don't tell him you sometimes hear Django talking to you in Swahili. Frank chuckled despite the gravity of the situation. I never said Django talks to me in Swahili. I said I've learned to understand what his different vocalizations mean, which is completely different. He straightened his best khaki shirt and checked his watch. Dr. Chen seems like a reasonable man from his credentials. Stanford educated, spent 5 years working with trauma patients before moving into competency evaluations. He'll be looking for signs of dementia, psychosis, or severe depression that might impair my judgment. The evaluation began formally at 10 a.m. in Frank's small living room, with Marcus observing from a corner chair and Sarah taking notes as an interested party. Dr. Chen was a slight, serious man in his 40s who asked questions with the methodical precision of someone who'd conducted hundreds of similar assessments. Frank's responses were measured and thoughtful. He correctly identified the date, the President of Kenya, and the current American president. His memory of recent events was sharp, his reasoning process clear and logical. "Tell me about your relationship with this lion," Dr. Chen requested, consulting notes that Marcus had undoubtedly influenced. "Mr. Thornfield has expressed concerns that your attachment to the animal may be affecting your ability to make rational decisions about public safety." Frank's answer was the product of weeks of careful preparation. Django was an orphaned cub that would have died without intervention. I provided that intervention following established protocols for wildlife rehabilitation. The unusual aspect is that instead of being relocated to a sanctuary or zoo, he was successfully reintegrated into wild populations while maintaining a non-aggressive relationship with humans. This outcome represents a significant conservation success story. Dr. Chen made careful notes, his expression revealing nothing. "Mr. Thornfield has provided documentation suggesting that you sometimes exhibit behaviors consistent with believing this lion has human-like cognitive abilities. Can you explain your perspective on the animal's intelligence?" This was dangerous territory, and Sarah held her breath as Frank navigated between honesty and what might sound like delusion. Dr. Mitchell's research has documented cognitive behaviors in Django that exceed typical parameters for wild lions. These behaviors include complex problem-solving, emotional responses to human distress, and what appears to be deliberate protective behavior toward other species. I believe Django represents an important opportunity to study advanced cognition in large predators. The questioning continued for 2 hours, covering Frank's medical history, his decision-making processes, and his understanding of the risks involved in protecting a wild lion. Dr. Chen was thorough but not hostile, and Sarah began to feel cautiously optimistic about the outcome. Frank was clearly competent, clearly rational, and clearly capable of making informed decisions about complex wildlife management issues. Then, emergency sirens shattered the afternoon silence. A tourist vehicle had overturned 3 kilometers from Frank's station, and the radio crackled with urgent calls for medical assistance and immediate rescue coordination. The Land Rover had been carrying a German family of 4 when the driver swerved to avoid a buffalo herd and lost control on loose gravel. The vehicle had rolled twice before coming to rest in a rocky drainage, and initial reports suggested serious injuries to multiple passengers. "All available personnel respond immediately," the radio dispatcher announced. "We need medical evacuation and specialized rescue equipment at GPS coordinates." The numbers that followed placed the accident in rough terrain that would be difficult for emergency vehicles to access. Dr. Chen looked up from his notepad with the expression of a man whose careful evaluation had just been interrupted by real-world chaos. "Should we postpone this assessment until the emergency is resolved?" "No need," Marcus said quickly, clearly hoping that Frank's absence during a crisis would demonstrate his declining ability to handle responsibilities. "Mr. Hartwell's condition makes it inadvisable for him to participate in emergency response activities. The younger Rangers can handle this situation." But Frank was already reaching for his radio and medical kit, his competency evaluation forgotten in the face of human suffering. "This is Hartwell at Acacia Point. I'm responding with medical supplies and trauma experience." "ETA 15 minutes. "Frank, you can't," Sarah protested, thinking about his heart condition and the stress of a rescue operation. "Your doctor said any serious physical exertion could trigger another episode." "People are hurt," Frank replied simply, checking the contents of his emergency medical bag with practiced efficiency. "Everything else can wait." What happened next transformed Dr. Chen's routine competency evaluation into something unprecedented in his professional experience. As Frank's Land Rover approached the accident site, Django appeared from seemingly nowhere, running alongside the vehicle with the purposeful stride of an animal responding to understood urgency. When Frank parked at the edge of the drainage and began making his way down the rocky slope toward the overturned vehicle, Django followed at a careful distance. The German family was in serious condition. The father had a suspected spinal injury, the mother was unconscious with obvious head trauma, and their 2 children were trapped in the back seat by twisted metal. Frank's military medic training from Vietnam took over as he stabilized the worst injuries and began the careful process of extracting victims from wreckage that could shift at any moment. It was during the extraction of the 8-year-old daughter that Django made his move. The child was pinned by debris that required lifting from an awkward angle, and Frank's positioning made it impossible for him to maintain leverage while protecting his back. Without being asked or directed, Django approached the wreckage and used his considerable strength to hold a twisted door panel steady while Frank maneuvered the child to safety. "Doctor?" Chen watched in stunned silence as a wild lion actively participated in a human rescue operation, following Frank's hand signals and responding to verbal directions with the precision of a trained service animal. When emergency helicopters arrived 30 minutes later, they found all 4 accident victims stabilized and ready for evacuation, with Frank providing detailed medical reports and Django lying calmly 20 feet away. In 23 years of psychological evaluation, Dr. Chen told Marcus as they watched the helicopters disappear toward Nairobi, "I have never witnessed anything comparable to what just occurred. Mr. Hartwell's judgment appears not only sound, but remarkably validated by circumstances. That animal's behavior suggests a level of interspecies cooperation that challenges fundamental assumptions about wildlife management." Marcus's face had gone ashen as his carefully planned psychological evaluation backfired spectacularly. Instead of demonstrating Frank's incompetence, the emergency had provided irrefutable evidence of both Frank's sound judgment and Django's extraordinary nature. The elimination order that had seemed inevitable 3 hours earlier suddenly looked like bureaucratic overreach based on outdated assumptions rather than observable reality. But Marcus Thornfield hadn't spent 20 years hunting dangerous animals only to be deterred by one impressive performance. If legal challenges and competency evaluations wouldn't clear his path to revenge, he would find another way to ensure that Django died and Frank Hartwell's life's work crumbled into dust. The massive heart attack struck Frank Hartwell at sunset on a Thursday evening, when the African sky was painted in shades of gold and crimson that reminded him achingly of Margaret's hair in sunlight 40 years ago. He'd been sitting on his porch, writing in the leather journal that had become his nightly ritual, documenting every detail of Django's behavior for Sarah to use in her research. The pen fell from his fingers mid-sentence, clattering onto the wooden boards as crushing pain exploded across his chest like a star going supernova. Sarah found him 20 minutes later, collapsed against the porch railing with his journal scattered around him like fallen leaves. His face was gray as old ash, his breathing shallow and irregular, but his eyes were still alert when she knelt beside him. "Don't you dare die on me now," she whispered fiercely, checking his pulse with hands that trembled despite years of field medical training. "Not when we've just found each other. Not when Django still needs you." Frank tried to speak, but the words came out as a harsh whisper that she had to lean close to understand. "The journals. Everything's in the journals. Tell Sarah. Tell her about Margaret's garden. Tell her—" His voice faded as another wave of pain washed over him, and Sarah fumbled for her radio with desperate urgency. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Dr. Mitchell at Acacia Point Station. Medical emergency, need immediate helicopter evacuation for cardiac arrest. Patient is male, 73 years old, previous history of heart disease, currently conscious but critical condition." Her voice remained professionally calm, even as her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird. The response was devastating in its efficiency. "Dr. Mitchell, this is Nairobi Emergency Services. Weather conditions have grounded all medical helicopters until morning. Nearest ground ambulance is 4 hours out on rough terrain. Recommend stabilizing patient for transport to Kikarok Airstrip at first light." 4 hours. Frank didn't have 4 hours, and they both knew it. Sarah did everything she could with her limited medical supplies: oxygen from the emergency kit, aspirin to thin his blood, careful positioning to ease the strain on his damaged heart. But she was a behavioral scientist, not a physician, and watching her father die while feeling completely helpless was a special kind of torture that no amount of education had prepared her for. It was during those desperate hours that Django arrived. Sarah heard his distinctive approach call, a low rumbling that was somehow both greeting and question, and looked up to see the massive lion emerging from the darkness beyond the porch light. For 12 years, Django had maintained careful boundaries around human habitation, never approaching the station buildings after dark. But tonight was different. Tonight, the rules no longer applied. "He knows," Frank whispered, his voice barely audible but his eyes tracking Django's careful approach. "Lions can smell death coming. He's saying goodbye." Django settled himself at the base of the porch steps, his golden eyes reflecting the lantern light as he maintained vigil over the man who'd saved his life. Other lions would have disappeared into the night, following instincts that avoided human contact during vulnerable moments. But Django remained, his presence somehow both protective and mournful, as if he understood that this was a sacred passage that required witness. The ambulance finally arrived at 2 a.m., its headlights cutting through darkness that had been broken only by Django's silent presence. The paramedics were experienced professionals who'd seen every kind of medical emergency the African bush could produce, but they paused uncertainly when they spotted the lion maintaining guard duty 20 feet from their patient. "Is that animal sedated?" the lead paramedic asked, his hand moving instinctively toward the tranquilizer gun that was standard equipment for emergency calls in wildlife areas. "No," Sarah replied firmly, stepping between the medical team and Django. "He's protecting Frank. He won't interfere if you don't threaten him." Loading Frank onto the stretcher required careful coordination around Django's protective presence. The lion never moved from his position, but his amber eyes tracked every movement as strangers lifted his human father into the back of a vehicle that would carry him away from everything familiar. When the ambulance doors closed, separating Frank from the home he'd built in the African wilderness, Django's anguished roar echoed across the grasslands like a funeral dirge. Frank Hartwell died on the operating table at Nairobi General Hospital at 6:47 a.m., his damaged heart finally surrendering after 73 years of carrying more grief than one man should have to bear. The last words in his journal, written in shaky handwriting just before the final attack, were a message for the daughter he'd found too late and the lion who'd given meaning to his last years. Love doesn't end with death. It just changes form. Sarah received the news via phone call while sitting in the hospital waiting room, surrounded by the antiseptic smell of industrial cleaning supplies and the hollow conversations of other people waiting for word about their own tragedies. The doctor's words seemed to come from very far away, clinical terminology that transformed her father into a case study rather than a human being who'd just taught her what it meant to love something more than your own safety. Time of death, 6:47 a.m. Cause massive myocardial infarction. We did everything possible, Dr. Mitchell. His heart was simply too damaged to survive another episode. Sarah nodded numbly, signed the necessary paperwork, and began making phone calls to arrange for Frank's body to be transported back to Masai Mara for burial. But all she could think about was Django, maintaining his vigil at an empty ranger station, waiting for a man who would never come home. The first revelation came during Frank's funeral preparation, when Sarah discovered the sealed envelope marked "For Sarah, to be opened after my death," tucked inside his worn leather Bible. Her hands shook as she broke the wax seal, Frank's careful handwriting swimming before her eyes as tears blurred her vision. The letter began simply, "My dearest daughter, if you're reading this, then I've finally found the courage to tell you the truth about why I really came to Kenya. I didn't come here to find redemption through wildlife conservation," Frank had written in his precise script. "I came here to die. After Margaret passed and I gave you away, I spent 30 years trying to drink myself into the grave. The farm was failing. I'd lost touch with everyone who mattered, and every morning felt like a punishment for all the ways I'd failed the people I was supposed to protect. Kenya was supposed to be my final destination, a place remote enough that my death wouldn't inconvenience anyone." Sarah's breath caught as she read the next paragraph. "But then I found Django, or maybe he found me. Taking care of that dying cub gave me a reason to stay sober, a reason to wake up each morning, a reason to believe that maybe broken things could heal if you loved them enough. He saved my life before I ever saved his. And when you arrived 3 years ago, I realized God had given me the chance to know my daughter after all, even if I was too much of a coward to tell you who I really was." The letter continued with details that shattered Sarah's understanding of her own story. Frank revealed that he'd been anonymously funding her education since graduate school, channeling money through a scholarship foundation he'd established in Margaret's name. He'd followed her career obsessively, reading every paper she published, celebrating her successes from a distance while wrestling with the guilt of not being present for her struggles. "The $2.3 million was never meant for my retirement," Frank wrote. "It was always meant for you and Django, the daughter I lost and the son I found. I know Marcus will try to kill him after I'm gone, and I know the legal system won't protect him forever. But maybe, with enough money and determination, you can give him the sanctuary he deserves. You're the only person on earth who loves him as much as I do." The final paragraph destroyed what remained of Sarah's composure. "I've made a lot of mistakes in my 73 years, but saving Django wasn't one of them. Taking care of you from a distance wasn't enough, but it was all I had the courage to do. If there's an afterlife, I hope I get to see you both again. My daughter, the scientist, and my son, the lion, both of you proof that love can transcend any boundary if you're brave enough to let it." While Sarah grappled with Frank's posthumous revelations, Marcus Thornfield was dealing with discoveries of his own. The manila folder he'd been avoiding for weeks finally demanded attention. and the documents inside forced him to confront 20 years of carefully constructed justification for his hatred of large predators. The incident report from 2008 was devastating enough, learning that he'd saved Frank's life 15 years before planning to destroy Frank's life's work. But the medical examiner's report from his son David's death was even worse. Victim sustained fatal injuries from adult female lion, estimated weight 280 pounds, in apparent territorial defense behavior, the report stated with clinical precision. Physical evidence suggests victim approached to within approximately 10 meters of concealed cubs before attack occurred. No evidence of stalking or predatory behavior. Animal behavior consistent with protective maternal response to perceived threat to offspring. Marcus had read that report countless times over the years, but he'd always focused on the outcome rather than the circumstances. David had died because a mother lion was protecting her babies, the same protective instinct that Marcus himself had failed to exercise when he'd allowed his 8-year-old son to wander ahead during that tracking expedition in Botswana. The guilt he'd been carrying for 20 years wasn't just about David's death, it was about his own failure as a father to keep his child safe. The medical report included details that Marcus had somehow blocked from memory. Evidence that the attacking lioness had been wounded, possibly by hunting activity in the area earlier that day. Marcus suddenly remembered the hunting party he'd been tracking, the wounded lioness they'd been pursuing, the way David had run ahead while Marcus stopped to examine tracks. His son hadn't been killed by a randomly aggressive predator. He'd been killed by a mother defending injured offspring from the very hunting expedition Marcus had been conducting. "I created the situation that killed my son," Marcus whispered to the empty office, the words falling like stones into decades of misdirected rage. "I wounded her first, then let David walk into her territory while she was protecting wounded cubs. I killed him, not the lions, me." The revelation should have been liberating, but instead it felt like drowning. For 20 years, Marcus had sustained himself on hatred for an entire species, building a career around eliminating dangerous predators who reminded him of his loss. Learning that his hatred was based on his own guilt rather than legitimate threat assessment left him with nothing, no purpose, no mission, no reason for getting up each morning and continuing the hunt. But even worse than losing his motivation for revenge was discovering the files that revealed his target's true stories. Django wasn't just another problem lion on Marcus's elimination list. He was the offspring of the lioness that had killed David. DNA analysis from a research project 3 years earlier had identified Django's genetic lineage, connecting him directly to the Botswana pride that had been Marcus's obsession for 2 decades. Subject exhibits genetic markers consistent with the Chobe River Pride, specifically the F2 alpha lineage associated with incident BR 2003-047. The scientific report stated in language that reduced a family tragedy to coded references. Marcus stared at the genetic data until his eyes blurred, trying to process the cosmic cruelty of circumstance that had brought him face to face with the biological descendant of his son's killer. The irony was almost too perfect to believe. Frank Hartwell had raised and protected the grandchild of the lioness that had destroyed Marcus's family, while Marcus had unknowingly saved the life of the man who would become his greatest enemy. The interconnectedness felt like divine punishment or divine comedy, depending on perspective, but either way, it demonstrated how thoroughly Marcus had misunderstood the nature of his own story. As Frank's funeral approached, Marcus found himself standing at a crossroads he'd never anticipated. He could proceed with Django's elimination, using his legal authority to destroy the descendant of his son's killer and completing a circle of revenge that had consumed half his life. or he could acknowledge that his hatred had been built on foundations of guilt and misdirected grief, and find some other way to honor David's memory than perpetuating cycles of violence. The decision became more complicated when Helen Thornfield arrived from England, stepping off the plane at Nairobi International with the determined expression of a woman who'd spent 20 years watching her ex-husband destroy himself with obsession. She'd come to Kenya not to support Marcus's mission, but to stop it, to force him to confront the reality that their son would have been horrified by the man his father had become. David loved animals, Helen reminded Marcus during their confrontation at his Nairobi hotel. He wanted to be a veterinarian, remember? He spent hours watching nature documentaries, asking questions about animal behavior, dreaming about working in wildlife conservation. And you've spent 20 years killing the creatures he wanted to protect, telling yourself it's somehow in his honor. Helen's words cut deeper than any official reprimand or legal challenge could have, because they forced Marcus to remember the child David had actually been rather than the symbol Marcus had created from his grief. David Thornfield had been 8 years old, fascinated by lions and elephants and giraffes, excited about their African adventure, completely unafraid of the wildlife he'd traveled thousands of miles to see. He would have been devastated to learn that his death had been used to justify decades of systematic killing. "I can't bring him back," Marcus said quietly, staring out the hotel window toward the Nairobi National Park, where wildlife roamed within sight of skyscrapers. "But I can stop making his death into an excuse for more death." The choice to attend Frank's funeral rather than proceeding with Django's elimination was the hardest decision Marcus had made in 20 years, but it felt like the first honest thing he'd done since David died. 6 months after Frank Hartwell's funeral, the Frank Hartwell Memorial Sanctuary encompassed 10,000 acres of pristine Kenyan wilderness funded by his life savings and an unexpected inheritance that had transformed tragedy into hope. Sarah Mitchell stood on the observation deck of the newly constructed research center, watching Django lead his pride across grasslands that would be protected in perpetuity, and marveled at how completely her life had changed since that morning when she'd first seen her father's name on a hospital form. The sanctuary had become more than just a safe haven for Django and his family. It had evolved into a revolutionary model for human-wildlife coexistence that attracted researchers, conservationists, and visitors from around the world. Sarah's documentation of Django's extraordinary cognitive abilities had been published in the Journal of Animal Behavior to international acclaim, fundamentally challenging scientific understanding of large predator intelligence and emotional capacity. The paper had already been cited in dozens of subsequent studies and had sparked a global conversation about the ethical implications of wildlife management policies. Marcus Thornfield had undergone the most dramatic transformation of anyone involved in Frank's story. After resigning from his position with the Wildlife Protection Services, he donated his entire life savings to the sanctuary and taken a job as head of anti-poaching operations. The man who'd spent 20 years hunting dangerous predators now dedicated himself to protecting them from the very poachers who'd orphaned Django decades earlier. His military background and tactical expertise made him extraordinarily effective at his new mission, but Sarah suspected his real motivation was more personal than professional. "I can't bring David back," Marcus had explained during one of their evening conversations on the research center's porch, "but I can make sure other children get to grow up in a world where magnificent creatures like Django still exist. Maybe that's a better way to honor my son's memory than the path I was on before." The reconciliation between Marcus and Django had been the most remarkable aspect of the sanctuary's early months. The first time Marcus encountered Django after Frank's funeral, Sarah had expected tension or aggression from the lion who'd been hunted so relentlessly. Instead, Django had approached Marcus calmly, studied him for several long moments, and then settled nearby as if accepting the former hunter's presence in his territory. It was as if Django understood that Marcus posed no threat, despite their complicated history. "He forgave me before I forgave myself," Marcus observed, watching Django patrol the sanctuary boundaries with the purposeful stride of an animal who knew his territory was secure. Animals don't carry grudges the way humans do. They assess present reality rather than nursing past grievances. There's wisdom in that. Sarah had found her own form of healing through the work of building Frank's legacy. The research center had become her permanent home, and she'd expanded her studies beyond Django to include the entire ecosystem of the sanctuary. Her adopted Maasai children, 3 orphans whose parents had been killed in poaching incidents, had integrated seamlessly into sanctuary life, learning both traditional Maasai culture and modern conservation science. They called her Mama Sarah and treated Django and his pride as extended family members, a relationship that would have seemed impossible to previous generations of both cultures. The Sunday ritual that had begun spontaneously after Frank's death had evolved into something sacred for everyone connected to the sanctuary. Each week at sunset, Sarah would walk to Frank's grave site with whoever wished to join her. Sometimes just Marcus and the children, sometimes visiting researchers or community elders, sometimes dozens of people who'd been touched by Frank's story. Django always appeared for these gatherings, settling quietly near the simple stone marker while the human community shared memories, plans, and hopes for the future. "Dad would have loved seeing this," Sarah said during one such gathering, watching her youngest adopted daughter sketch Django in her notebook while her older brothers discussed predator behavior with visiting graduate students. "He always believed that love could transcend any boundary if you were brave enough to let it. This sanctuary is proof that he was right." The economic impact of the sanctuary had exceeded everyone's expectations. Tourism revenue had increased dramatically as visitors came from around the world to see the lion who attended his father's funeral and learn about the revolutionary research being conducted there. Local Maasai communities had benefited through employment opportunities, cultural tourism programs, and educational initiatives that connected traditional knowledge with modern conservation practices. The sanctuary had become a model for community-based conservation that was being replicated across East Africa. Helen Thornfield visited the sanctuary twice each year, usually arriving on the anniversary of David's death to spend quiet time reflecting on how differently her son's story had ended compared to Django's. She'd established a scholarship fund for African children pursuing wildlife conservation education, channeling her grief into opportunities for the next generation of protectors. During her visits, she often sat with Marcus and Sarah in the evenings, sharing stories about David's fascination with African wildlife and his dreams of becoming a veterinarian. David would have been 38 this year, Helen said during her most recent visit, watching Django's cubs play in the late afternoon sun. "I like to think he would have been here with us, studying these magnificent creatures instead of fearing them. In a way, through this sanctuary, he is here. His death helped create the foundation for all this healing." The sanctuary's success had inspired similar projects across Africa and beyond, demonstrating that individual acts of love and dedication could have far-reaching consequences for wildlife conservation. Frank's story had been adapted into documentaries, children's books, and academic case studies, spreading the message that meaningful connections between humans and wildlife were not only possible but essential for the survival of both species. As Sarah watched another African sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from a lonely researcher studying animal behavior to a woman surrounded by family, both human and animal. Frank's greatest regret, giving away his daughter, had ultimately led to his greatest triumph, creating a legacy that would protect wildlife for generations to come. Django's roar echoed across the sanctuary as darkness approached, a sound that no longer spoke of loss or grief, but of contentment, security, and the deep satisfaction of a life lived with purpose and surrounded by love. At 73, Frank Hartwell thought his story was over, a lonely widower who'd given away his only child and spent decades drowning in regret. But sometimes life gives us second chances in the most unexpected forms. When Frank saved an orphaned lion cub named Django, he didn't just rescue an animal. He discovered that it's never too late to become the father you were meant to be. Django's loyalty transcended species, attending Frank's funeral and teaching everyone present that love doesn't end with death. It transforms into legacy. For Sarah, finding her biological father at 35 proved that family isn't just about shared DNA. It's about showing up when it matters most. Frank's $2.3 million inheritance wasn't just money. It was proof that every sacrifice, every act of love, every moment of choosing others over ourselves creates ripples that can change the world. The sanctuary they built together now protects countless animals and employs entire communities, showing that our deepest regrets can become our greatest contributions. Your life isn't over at 55, 65, or 75. There are still lions to save, families to heal, legacies to build. What Django is waiting for your love? What second chance story are you writing? Share with us. What second chance opportunity has surprised you in your later years? What legacy are you most proud of creating?